Good Vach Shavuot. We are on Mem Hey Amud Aleph. We are really moving along. Okay, so we are, if you're in the article 45A1, bottom of the first column. So the Mishnah said as follows. The Mishnah told us that someone who goes and leaves their, their tchum area, they're allowed to go return to their place. They're allowed to go back to their place. Now, the implication of that line is they're allowed to go back no matter how far it is. So if they went out to go save, again, they're leaving to rescue people. So let's say there are IDF soldiers, okay, and they hear about some terrible situation beyond the tchum of their city, they're allowed to leave. And then the Mishnah implies they're allowed to go back. Vafilu tuva, implication is they're allowed to go back. However, Amaz Resha, Apayim Amad Sulo, the first part of the Mishnah said that everyone who is allowed to leave with permission, in other words, someone who's going to save lives is certainly allowed to leave permission. It says they only have 2,000 amos, and the implication is, well, it explicitly says no more than 2,000 amos. So how do you reconcile this? Rav Yehuda says, in the name of Rav, we're not actually saying that when that line that says all those who go out go back to their place, it's not referring to the people. The people actually only have 2,000 amos and that's it. What it means is that the weapons that they take, even though there's no Eruv around, meaning an Eruv that would enable them to carry, they're allowed to carry their Eruv into, they're allowed to carry the Eruv with them. Okay, we'll see why soon, okay? That is the first answer. However, the Gemara asks, my kusha, why is there a contradiction in the first place? Dilma lahatzil shani. Maybe there is a distinction to be made. Maybe the first part of the Mishnah, when it says people who leave with permission, that's referring to people like someone who is going to help someone give birth. Okay, so you're a nurse, you're a doctor, and you hear that someone is giving birth beyond the tchum, so you let it go. You let it go. It's saving lives. You hear someone's drowning. You hear there's a fire, and you're a fireman, so you're allowed to go outside the tchum to go save them. No problem. But the only people who are allowed to go back for beyond those people is the first line of the Mishnah. The first line of the Mishnah said they only have 2,000 amos. But Dilma lahatzil shani, meaning if you're going to rescue, if you're going to fight, those people have more. Are able to go back even more than 2,000 amos. Why is that? The reason for that, I'm sorry, I bit my tongue right before I began this year. Okay, so the reason for that is that a rescuer, someone who is a soldier, if let's say you only let them go 2,000 amos, and let's say someone's chasing them. Let's say they fight and now someone still comes after them, right? There's a big concern they're going to still be in danger, and therefore, whereas a person who goes to help someone give birth, okay, you have 2,000 amos and that's it. A person who goes to help someone with a fire, 2,000 amos and that's it. But someone who's going to fight, now they have to come back because they want to get out of the way of danger, and maybe sometimes they have to move away from where they just fought, and therefore the Gemara says maybe from our Mishnah alone there is no contradiction. However, Eli Kasha HaKasha, there is a contradiction somewhere else. Why? This time it's taught in the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah. Barishona. Initially, when the witnesses would come to testify for the new moon, they did not move from the courtyard all day long. They had to stay in that courtyard where they testified. However, Gamliel was concerned that if they only had those 2,000 amos, people would not actually go in to testify for the new moon, and therefore he said you have 2,000 amos. And not only for the people coming to testify, but rather now listen to the list. Included in this allowance, when Leal said, I'm concerned that people are not going to come to testify for the new moon, and therefore I have to give the person 2,000 amos. And he said, I'm not going to only allow this for those people, but also there's other people who I'm also want to ensure that they are going to travel, and I'm therefore going to give them 2,000 amos. Who's included? A midwife who comes to give help in a delivery. Someone who comes to rescue people from an attacking army. We have our contradiction, right? We'll come back to this in a second. From a flooding river, from a collapsed building, or from a fire, like the people of the city, and they have a right to walk 2,000 amos in every direction. Visulo, ask the Gemara, no more than 2,000 amos, are you sure? Our Mishnah said that they do have more than 2,000 amos. The Mishnah said that those who go to rescue, meaning those who go to save fellow Jews from an attacking army, are allowed to go back to their places even more than 2,000 amos. So now we have a bona fide contradiction. Again, in our Mishnah, we could have said the first part of the Mishnah is talking about people who are not going to be endangered after they just did what they had to do. The last part of the Mishnah is talking about people who are soldiers or people who are going to fight against non-Jews who are attacking Jews. Therefore, they're able to get more than 2,000 amos to keep them out of danger. However, now that we quote this Mishnah Rosh Hashanah, there it says explicitly that the people who are going to rescue people from an attacking army only have 2,000 amos, and yet in our Mishnah, the simple read is that they have more. So, two possible answers. Now we're going to re-invoke these two answers. So first, you could say, again, like we saw earlier in our Mishnah, the way to address this is saying that really it doesn't mean, and our Mishnah never said that you're allowed to go back more than 2,000 amos. Rather, it means they're allowed to carry their weapons back with them, but still within 2,000 amos. What's that all about? Originally, when people who were, the shomrim of the area, the IDF soldiers, when they would be called, there's a bell ringing, go and rescue Jews from being attacked, they would go, and then when they would come back, they would put their weapons in the first house that they would reach. They wouldn't bring it all the way back home. Okay, why? Because they weren't allowed to carry it, so they bring it back to the first safe place they're able to find. One time the enemy spotted them, they put their weapons down, the enemy spotted them and started running after them. And the Jews went into that house taking their weapons. In other words, had it not been Shabbos, they would have had their weapons with them. But since it was Shabbos, they went to attack once, and then they bring them back to the safe house, okay? And then they're walking around, and the enemies see them, so they start running back to the house. The enemies run after them into the house. Tragically, in the panic, the Jews trampled one another, they killed one another, more than the enemies had killed the enemy. More than the enemies had killed the Jewish people. In other words, because the Jews were in this panic, in this frenzy, they killed one another in the stampede, getting their weapons, more than the non-Jews actually killed the Jews. At that time, they decreed that they would be allowed to return to their places with their weapons. Okay, and so the first answer to the question of the contradiction is that yes, they only have 2,000 amos. They're not allowed to go back more than that, but they are allowed to carry their weapons with them wherever they go. They don't have to put them down as soon as they're able to. And that's, again, to prevent this, terrible, tragic situation. Rav Nachman Yitzchak Amar Lo Kasha, new answer, in the Mishnah Rosh Hashanah, which says they're only allowed to go 2,000 amos, that's when they obliterated their enemies, and therefore there's no further risk. However, in our Mishnah, which it says they're allowed to go even further, and now according to this answer, we're saying no. Read the Mishnah saying they're allowed to go even further than 2,000 amos. Here in Eruvin, where it says they go even further, is where the non-Jews actually were victorious. Now the Jewish people are on retreat. Of course, you're allowed to go more than 2,000 amos. You could run as far as you need in order to stay safe, and therefore we don't want to restrict them to 2,000 amos. Okay, and we have some Agadata. Amar Yehuda Amar Rav Nachum Shetaru. Before we get to Agadata, Nachum Shetaru Yaras Yisrael. If non-Jews besiege a Jewish city on Shabbos, Jews are not allowed to go outside to fight against them with weapons. Shabbos are not allowed to desecrate Shabbos. If non-Jews besieged a Jewish city, you're not allowed to go and fight them on Shabbos. However, when they come to attack over monetary issues, the threat is only on property and things of that nature. But if they came to fight and there was a threat to the lives of the people, then of course you go out with weapons and fight. You could desecrate Shabbos in order to save people. However, I think Gemara qualifies this. If it is a city that is close to the border of the Jewish area, even if they did not come over matters of life, even if they just came to take some straw, stubble, etc., Jews are allowed to go out and out against them with their weapons, and violate Shabbos. Bavel is like a city close to the border, and therefore you're allowed to defend it on Shabbos, even if there's a raid that's just taking money. But Targuma, when it says Bavel, he means Nardan, which was a Jewish center and was an important city to protect. That was an important city, and therefore, if there was an attack, even just to take food, just to take monetary value for property, you're allowed to go out and fight back, because the border cities, we recognize how vulnerable they are. So again, let's just summarize what's happening over here. In a situation where there's sakanas nefashos, in the case where there is a real danger, then of course you could go beyond the tchum, you could desecrate Shabbos, you could do whatever you need to save people's lives, and you could travel for that. If it is a matter of monetary issue, if let's say people are coming and it is only about money, they're only coming to steal things, but there's no threat to life, then you are not allowed to desecrate Shabbos for that. However, if they are on a border city where there's a concern that if they're going to be, the concern on a border city is that if you allow them to do a little bit, you allow them to start, spray painting and breaking this and taking these things, then eventually it's going to erode, and there's really going to be people ultimately put in danger, and therefore the border cities play such a critical role, and we recognize what's ultimately going to happen. We could see, we've been down this road before, therefore you are allowed to arm yourself and go wage war in such a situation. Practically speaking, if in a scenario, if someone is in the area, let's say, and they're breaking into cars and things of that nature, so really you would say it's mammonis. It's just they're coming to steal. They're not coming to harm anyone. So it's not so simple. First of all, We don't really know that. We don't really know, if that's the case, meaning, maybe they're armed, maybe they're not armed. We don't really know, and therefore the halacha is, practically speaking, that if you see someone doing something on Shabbos, which is illegal, which is criminal activity in the area, and, you see them breaking into a car, etc., you are allowed to call the police. You should call the police. You must call the police. It's not just your own property. You have to do it to save other people, and that is one of the things we could take from our Gemara. Okay, Darish Rav Dostai Demin Biri. Oh, I should just mention one other thing, actually, and that is that we see from this Gemara there's this concern, and Leal had that, if we don't give people extra leeway of traveling more, then we're concerned they're not going to go and save people in the future, right? Because if I'm going to go and help someone give birth, and now I'm only stuck in 4 amos, that's pretty lousy. So there is, this principle, broadly speaking, is applied to other cases, and that is, it applies in general to a person who works for Atzala or a doctor where there's a concern they're going to continuously be called. In other words, a person goes on Atzala call, they're not stuck for the rest of Shabbos wherever they find themselves. They're actually allowed to, theoretically, most Atzalas set things up where their car will pick them up, Nanju will pick them up and bring them back home. But the bottom line is they're allowed to do things which you and I wouldn't otherwise do in order to ensure, A, first of all, they might be called again, but B, also to ensure that they will be motivated and incentivized and they won't be, disincentivized to do this again, because now every person who's on an Atzala call, now they're stuck across town, they're not going to see their family the rest of Shabbos. That's terrible. So therefore, there are certain dispensations similar to what we see when we are doing over here, where we would allow them to, be driven back home and things of that nature in order to ensure that they will, again, be available for a future call, but even if not, so that they wouldn't be disincentivized from doing this in the future. Okay, Darsha B'Stai Min Biri. We have a drasha from Rav Dostai. This is a pasuk in Shmuel that says that the Pelishtim, they were told David that the Pelishtim were waging war against Ke'ilah, and they're taking from the threshing floors. Tanu Tana Brisa explaining this pasuk. Ke'ilah ira smuchla sfar haisa. Ke'ilah was a city close to the border. Vehim labo el iskin of Tevin v'kash, and the Pelishtim were coming to steal straw and stubble. They were pillaging the threshing floors, not harming anyone. And David asked Hashem, we'll see what this means in a moment, should I go to fight against the Pelishtim? Hashem said to David, go and fight against them, and you will defeat them and save Ke'ilah. So the idea of asking Hashem normally means asking the Urim and that's what we're going to assume over here. So Mike Mebaile, what was he asking? If he was asking if it's permitted or it's forbidden to fight against attacking Pelishtim, the Beis Din was in existence. If you have a halachic question, you don't go to the Urim you go to Beis Din. So Ela matzlach ilo matzlach. What he was asking the Urim was whether he'd be successful or not to Daikanami, and that you can deduce this as well from the pasuk, because the answer was Lech v'kisa b'Pelishtim. It doesn't just say go and fight them. Voshata es Ke'ilah. It says you're going to ultimately save Ke'ilah. In other words, you're going to succeed. Shema Mina, we see from here that was indeed the case. But this is brought in because we see Ke'ilah is a border city. We see the importance of fighting for the border cities, even when there is just monetary issues at stake. Okay, now we have a new Mishnah. Misha Yasha B'derech, a person who is traveling, and V'amad, and they stop. They stop, and Shabbos begins. V'ra Hari hu samach li'er. Okay, and you find out, in other words, you're traveling, and it's getting close to the end of Shabbos, close to Shabbos. You see the sun setting. You say, okay, I'm going to stop over here, set up camp. And you settle down, and then what happens? And then you're putting up your campsites, etc., etc. So now you're gonna have 2,000 amos around, and this is your place. And then you see that you're right near a city. You're within the tchum of a city, right? So if the person had realized this, then of course he would have made his residence in the city, because he would have wanted him to be part of the city. Now he's going to be included in the whole city. You have 2,000 amos beyond the whole city. But because he stopped here, so what's the halacha? Do we say that he's really part of the city? Because had he known, he would have for sure been included, that he would have wanted to be part of the city. Or do we say that, no, too bad, this is where he started. So the Tanakama says, since his intention was not, he didn't know about the city there, he's not allowed to go into the city. In other words, he only has his tchum around the little space that he's in. Divrei Meir. Rabbi Yehuda Amar, you can't let it go into the city, and you get the tchum of the entire of the city residence. Why? Because had he known, he would have wanted to be part of it, and therefore we assume that is his intention. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Ma'isa Hayav Nichlas, Ritarfan below Miskaven, Ritarfan entered the city and took on the tchum of the city's residence without having prior intention to do so. We're going to see what that story is all about. Tanya, Rabbi Brisa, 45:84. Rabbi Yehuda Ma'isa, Rabbi Tarfon, Mahalach B'derech, Rabbi Tarfon was traveling. V'chashchalo, and it got dark. V'lan chutz la'ir, and he spent the night outside the city. L'shachris mitzao roi bakar. In the morning, shepherds bumped into him. Amrullah, they said to him, Rabbi, the city's in front of you. It's less than 2,000 amos from here. Go into the city. So Nichnas v'yashav beis hamedrash. He went in, sat in the beis medrash, v'darash kol yom kulo, and he spent the whole day teaching Torah. So Rabbi Yehuda wants to bring a proof from here. You see, Rav Tarfon was not aware of the fact that the city was there, and he found it in the morning, And nonetheless, he went into the city, and presumably he's walking around the whole city. The base matters, who knows? The base matters maybe is deep into the city. He's walking around the whole city. So clearly, he's now considered part of the city, even though he wasn't actually in the city. But since he was part of the tchum of the city, we treat it as if he was in the city, like Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. So Rameir pushes back and says, Misham Raya. From there's a proof, Shem Beliba Haisa. Maybe in that case, Rav actually knew that the city was there. He just, he ran out of time, so he set up his camp outside the city, but he knew it was there. In other words, we don't know what was going through Tarfon's mind in the story. Furthermore, alternatively, even if he went into the city, all we know is he spent the whole day in the base medrash. Where was that base medrash? Was it within 2,000 amos of where he was? Because if it was, then that doesn't prove anything. Because when he camped out outside the city, he had 2,000 amos. Maybe the base medrash was within 2,000 amos, and that's why he was in the base medrash, and not because he was part of the whole city, and therefore there's no proof. Okay, new Mishnah. A person who falls asleep while on the journey, so on the road. He doesn't realize that it's dark, and therefore he never had in mind to really acquire this as a place, and therefore gets the whole, maybe he doesn't even get the whole tchum. Nonetheless, Menuri says, person has 2,000 amos. Even though he was sleeping, he wasn't conscientious of making this his residence, he has 2,000 amos. The Chum disagree, and they say, because he was sleeping, he didn't consciously acquire 2,000 amos area around him for his tchum, and therefore he only has 4 amos. Now the Mishnah says, how do we measure those 4 amos? Or the Yezer Omer, that he's in the middle. In other words, the person's over here, he has 2 amos over here, 2 amos over there. That's how we measure 2 amos. If Yehuda disagrees, no, he decides he's over here, he could go 4 amos this way, or he could go 4 amos this way, 4 amos this way, 4 amos this way. He gets to decide. If he started going in one direction, he can't choose a different direction. He says, I'm going to go to my right. And then he's like, you know what? I'm not going to go to my right. I'm going to go the other direction. Too bad. Rabbi Yehuda says you get to choose, but that's it. Okay, Hayushnaim. There are 2 people. Let's say 2 people are walking on Shabbos, and then they realize, I'm past the tchum. So they each have 4 amos, right? Now, mikta amos of they're walking next to each other. So let's say there's 2 people, and now they each have 2 people, and now there's these 4 amos, the 4 amos over here, and the 4 amos overlap because they're walking next to each other. So they have 2 amos that overlap. So Mevian v'ochlim emtzad, they have food and eat in the middle of that overlapping area because that's an area that's both part of their spaces, and therefore they eat together over there. A person's allowed to take from a person, guy over here can't take food from over here and bring it over here, and then this guy's going to take it and put it over here because that would be taking it from this person's space into that person's space. That you can't do, but they could share in the middle. Let's say there's 3 people. So you have 3 people, 1, 2, and then 3, and their 4 amos correspond, or let's say it's 4 people like this. So it's like 3 people, excuse me. So 1 person over here, 1 person over here, and then 1 person in the middle who overlaps on both their amos. So he's permitted to bring food and eat with both of them on both sides. They can eat with him. The people on the outside are prohibited from bringing food and eating with each other since there's no mutual area, right? Their areas are not, the 4 amos overlap over here, but the 2 amos, but these guys don't actually overlap. The 2 outer guys don't overlap. If I had 3 hands, I'd be able to do this properly. But basically, right, there's guy on the right, guy on the left, and the guy in the middle overlaps over here. So these guys on the sides, they could share with the middle guy, but they can't share with each other because there is no overlapping space. Okay, fine. What's it similar to? You have 3 chatzeros, 3 courtyards, which are open to one another. Okay, courtyard, and they have doors opening them all to one another. They also open to the public domain. So that being the case, they're all really treated as their own place because they all have their own entrance into the public domain, and really they could really just make a eruv amongst themselves. However, eruv shtaim inside, but they're also able to make eruv. They're able to make an eruv within each chatzar just to themselves. But in addition, they could also make eruv chatzeros between the different chatzeros. However, in the case of eruv shtaim imensais, let's say the 2 outer chatzeros joined in the eruv with the middle chatzer. The middle chatzar could bring things back and forth to the outer ones, and the outer residents of the residents of the outer chatzeros are permitted to bring things into his chatzar. Did I just read that? Yeah, I just read that. But the 2 outer ones are not able to, do anything with one another. They can't bring things from their place all the way into the place on the other side because they never made a eruv chatzeros with one another. And that's similar to our case of the people in the eruv tchumen when they overlap with the 3rd person over here. Okay, it'd be easier with my whiteboard, but we'll pick up Mir Hashem tomorrow and we'll analyze this Mishnah. Have a great day.